Next speakers are going to speak on a subject that I think is near and dear to all of us, about the health of the Upper St. Lawrence River through science, art, and stories. Dr. Jeff Ridal is the Executive Director of the River Institute. Jeff undertakes research related to water and sediment quality and the ecological impacts of contaminants in the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario. Jeff also often serves as a science advisor on projects related to environmental restoration and governance. He holds adjunct professorships with the School of Environmental Studies at Queen's University and the Department of Biology at Ottawa University. He also teaches in the environmental program as part of the River Institute partnership with St. Lawrence College in Cornwall. Jeff served as the Canadian co-chair of the Science Priority Committee of the Science Advisory Board for the International Joint Commission from 2014 to 2021. Stephany Hildebrand is a Montreal-based photographer and has been honing her skills in documentary photography for the past several years. Originally photographing artwork and interior design, Stephany has blended her photography skills with her scientific knowledge as an environmental technician, bringing about a union of two passions. With an eye for aesthetics and a scientific understanding of river ecosystems, Stephany has built an extensive archive of images documenting scientific research and community stories on the St. Lawrence River. So Jeff and Stephany, turn it over to you.
So thanks very much, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to tell the story about the Great River Report to this audience and to share it with you all and hopefully get you all involved at some point or another. I'm just seeing how this mouse, is it a mouse? You just scroll the mouse?
You should just feel the
Left click it. We didn't go over it. There we go. Did you move it or did me? Okay, you might have to move it. I might have to say next slide, if that's okay with you. So, as the executive director of the River Institute, the question I get asked most often over the years was, okay, how are we doing? What's the health of the river? And so, you know, you start thinking about, well, how do I answer that question? And I'll talk about it. It's a little complicated, right, to come up with a summary of what's the health of the river. But at the same time, we were seeing a lot of, you know, different groups sort of put out health reports. I was very intrigued by the University of Maryland. It was working with different water bodies around the world and doing a very good job at health reports. And there was others in Canada as well. And one, the WWF, was put out one on all the major rivers in Canada. But when it got to this St. Lawrence, and particularly the Upper St. Lawrence River, they got to a point where they couldn't really complete the assessment because basically they determined it was data deficient. So that we found that was interesting. Let's find out more about what that's about. So next slide. So fortunately for us, someone walked into our lives, Dr. Lee McGaughey, who is really the kind of the creator of this whole Great River Report. And she'd be here in my stead to do this, but she's in South Africa right now. I understand it's a little warmer there than here, and so she's allowed me to give this story together with Stephany today. And Dr. Lee McGaughey was actually doing health indicators and ecosystem indicators in different places around the world, but decided Cornwall was where she was going to stop for a while and settle down, and so we were happy to bring her on. Slide. And as we started to decide we're going to do this report, this was about 2018, Henry Lickers, who you probably all know, he was working as science advisor with the Mox Council of Akwesasne at that time, and he was a founding member of our board of directors at the River Institute, and he always had a big influence on kind of everything we did. And he was saying, if you do this, you have to kind of do it in the with the inspiration of the Hantan Galuadakwa, or the words that came before all else. So this is the Thanksgiving address. I think maybe Henry's done that here. And it's really addressing all the different levels of the relations we have with the ecosystem. So that was really one of the starting points. And then next slide. Following on that, Abraham Francis, who hopefully I think has also been here, and fantastic inspiration and co-creator of this report. And so really this Great River Report in many ways has been a really co-partnership with the Mohawks of Akwesasne and other partners, but really the influences and the inspiration really drives a lot from our partners at Akwesasne. So really what we're focused on here is really the upper St. Lawrence River. You know, of course, these different sectors of the river are kind of where you see the data sets because of the monitoring that goes there. So we have the Thousand Islands, Brockville, Lake St. Lawrence, where we heard already a lot about those sectors, and Lake St. Francis. And then because there's so much interesting data around Cornwall and Akwesasne and Messina due to the area of concern programs, we're sort of split that out as well, even though it is part of the larger Lake St. Francis. Next slide. So like I said, trying to answer the question of what is the health of the river is very complicated. You know, it's not an easy, it's like, okay, what part of the river are you interested in? What's your species? Are you into terns? Are you into, you know, water quality? Are you into something else? So there's so many different ways to answer that question. So it is complicated. So next slide, please. So we obviously decided we're going to do a holistic approach. We're going to look at ecosystem indicators, ecosystem health. It's going to be science-based. It's going to be inspired by our Indigenous partners. But we also want the community to be involved. We want to have that engagement with the community. So next slide. So as part of that, we wanted to start the conversation by undertaking a survey. We actually set out a survey, provided it online, really encouraged people. Got 450 respondents. We feel is pretty good. Next slide. And a pretty good graphical representation, geospatial representation along the upper St. Lawrence. Next slide. And so what we asked were 3 questions on this. What are the activities you like to do? How do you interact with the river? What are your concerns with the river? And just a broader category in terms of what you think are the biggest challenges. It's just like, just fill in the blank here. And that was that last slide. So this one, you can see it was interesting, you know, swimming, recreational fishing, water sports, so the traditional ones, but also number one thing that people identified was just sightseeing and relaxing by the river. So it was really interesting in terms of what came out in terms of the bird watching and other aspects that maybe you don't think of right away. Next slide. And then as terms of concerns, again, pollution, water quality, fish, water levels, we heard about that as well. But then also people are interested in things like the plants, the invertebrates. That was quite interesting to hear and to see that these are broad concerns that actually meet, you know, some of the people's level of interest and want to know more information about that. So next slide. In the last questions, we looked at those challenges and everyone said what they thought, and then we kind of parsed it together and created ended up with these areas. And when we, in terms of pollution, land use, climate change, invasive species, exploitation, all of these issues, and we started to look and say, hey, this really matches well with a study, a UN Sustainable Development Study that identified as a group of global scientists came up with saying exactly the same things, so saying these are the major challenges to biodiversity. So it's interesting to see how the community ended up landing on those same challenges. So okay, now that we know kind of what the concerns are, we brought the scientists together to sort of come up with ideas of what indicators could potentially be involved in this process of assessing the ecosystem health. Next slide. And so what they were doing was they were looking at the relevance of the indicators, potential indicators. The data availability is important, obviously. Importance to the public as identified, as well as the sensitivity of those particular measures or indicators to tell you and be responsive to changes over time. So I thought when we started with this, and the University of Maryland were a good example of, you get 9 to 12 indicators, and then that would be fine. Well, we ended up with 10 categories, but 35 indicators overall. And every time I think they went and tried to sort of take a few of them off the list, particularly speaking to Abe and other partners at Akwesasne. It was like, no, you can't take that off the list. That muskrat, that's too important to us. You can't take this off the list. So she said, okay, fine. That's what we're going to do. We're going to take these indicators. We're going to work at them. It's going to be a big project, we know, but these are important to us and to the community. So let's run with these. So we need a fairly big team. We've been able to pull together by hook and by crook, I guess, and a really great team of people that work with us at the Institute, and some of them are volunteering their time. Some of the people are involved at universities and contributing. Our advisory board, you see there, are very important, led with Henry and Michael Twist, who probably people know, Jerome Marty and others, Lee, you see, so it's a great group of people that are helping us out with this really large project. So let me tell you a little bit about the progress we've made to date. So we have a technical report. The idea is to establish a technical report. Each of the indicators would start off with a sort of that understanding of what's happening on a technical basis, and then each of these reports get written and then sent out for external review and feedback, and then we get it out, and Stephany is going to talk about how we get it out to the public. So Marianne Perron is a postdoctoral fellow who's working with us, and she's leading a lot of the technical report development together with Lee Magahi. So here's just an example, a snapshot of how this is working. A lot of the data you're going to get that's broad-based is going to be based on government monitoring programs. So for fish particularly, which is one of the first sets of indicators we were going to work on, is we have 7 fish indicators, and the idea is to pull that data as much as possible and as broadly as possible, and that's probably going to end up in many cases on government data such as the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in Ontario and New York DEC here in New York State, and looking at their monitoring data, gillnet monitoring data for these fish. And so what you see here is actually the relative abundance of fish caught in those monitoring programs. So as no surprise, yellow perch, smallmouth bass, walleye. And then you look at these iconic species, northern pike, lake sturgeon, and American eel, you see those really small percentages. And already there's a story there, because 50 years ago, those numbers were different. We know eel, for example, was a much larger part of the ecosystem in terms of numbers than what it is today. Next slide. So just delving into how we're looking at, for example, the yellow perch data. So we have this data from New York DEC in Ontario, and we're looking at the trends over time since 1980 up in the top corner with the Thousand Islands data. And you can see what it's reflecting is that sort of that higher levels back in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, and this has gradually declined to more stable levels since 2010. And the Ontario data, just across from it in the orange graph there, is about the same. It's a little shorter data set, so it's showing similar sort of results. Lake St. Lawrence, we see a kind of initial decline since in the 70s and 80s, but then a stabilization, sort of like a gradual rise. So overall, relatively stable. What really catches your eye is that Lake St. Francis data set, where you see these large swings and variations, right? And you start to say, okay, what's going on? And especially when you look at, actually, what I'm going to throw in that last little corner is Lake St. Francis, but the Quebec monitoring data. And what we find really interesting there is that data set's doing something very different. And that raises questions, what's going on? Why is the two monitoring results showing such a difference in terms of the population trends of yellow perch in this section of the river? Next slide. When we sent that out for a comment, people said, well, really should connect this to what's happening with nutrients. We think that's the major sort of determinant of yellow perch populations over time. So what we have up in that top graph is, again, the bumpy orange bit are those yellow perch catches over time since the late 1970s. And what you have kind of showing a very consistent, similar sort of overall trend are your phosphorus data. Phosphorus is the key nutrient that's fertilizing the ecosystem, especially in freshwater ecosystems. And this is the base of your bottom-up driver that's sort of supporting the fish population. So what you see down in that bottom graph is this correlation that says about 35% of the variation in that yellow perch population is really accounted for by that decline in phosphorus levels. So now the question was, that's kind of still a fairly narrow view. What happens over the longer period of time? So this really, Marianne that took this to another level, and what she found is some commercial landings data that went back to 1913. Okay, and it's 1913 to 2015. This is for Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River together, so it's a little bit of a different data set. But the point is what's being made here is those bars are the commercial landings of yellow perch in the system, and the colors indicate the changes in phosphorus concentrations. So what we have is, as you get into the 50s and through the 60s, 70s, you have the darker reds. You see the higher phosphorus concentrations up to, 25 micrograms per liter, very high levels relative to what we had before. And then the commercial catches that could be supported by those levels of nutrients. Then what you see here is there's the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement came into place, nutrient abatement, okay? And so with that, the nutrients started to be declined and being pulled out of the system. And for many years, even though the nutrients were declining, and we're going from red transitioning to that yellow, you see those commercial landings were still being supported, were being taken. So there's a lot being taken out of the system, even though the nutrients that supports that ecosystem had declined quite a bit. So that's a real important top-down. We talked about bottom-up and top-down sort of thing with that commercial effort and pressure on top of that. Next slide. So basically the graphic here is just sort of explaining this general concept is that, you know, as the nutrient levels expanded through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it could carry a broader amount of that ecosystem, of that food base during that time period. But then as it contracted again through the last number of years, that available amount of biomass that we would like to have access to through yellow perch or other species is actually a lot lower than what it used to be. So the system has changed, right? This is, I don't even need to discuss or even explain this graph because I think it was talked about already by Lee Harper and others, but this is the other question we get. Well, what about the pressure? What about those cormorants? They came in and they put so much pressure. So yes, that was another pressure on the system for yellow perch, especially in the late 90s when the cormorants came back in spades back into the upper St. Lawrence River. And about 50% of their diet at the time was actually made up of yellow perch based on those regurgitated pellets, the analysis. And what you see is the graphic is showing that what Lee described was that has over time this amount on the pressure on the yellow perch populations has declined substantially because the round goby is now the preferred prey by the cormorants. So the last thing I'll just say is that we little interesting thing is this yellow perch populations Lake St. Francis, where you have this really fairly impressive swing in terms of what's being caught in the gill nets, and this difference with Quebec data. So that's really something actually that they've taken a look at recently, and they're actually this past year in 2022, Quebec and Ontario got together to sort of compare their methods to make sure their methodologies were similar. But we also know that this small red part is Ontario. This is below Lake St. Francis, below the Moses Sanders Dam, is managed differently. There's Ontario-based management decisions versus the Quebec management decisions. So that alone could also account for some of the differences we're seeing in this dynamic. So I think this is my last slide. So basically the report sort of results in these fairly sort of broad recommendations to ensure that certainly fishery limits are set to meet the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. There's also a recommendation to pay close attention to the recruitment rates of yellow perch in the system. And then further research is needed to make sure we understand why we're seeing these differences between Ontario and Quebec. So with that, I'd like to pass it over now to Stephany Hildebrand, who is the creator, the visual creator of a lot of these graphics and the photography. So Stephany?
Thank Thank you, Jeff, and thank you everyone for having me today. I'm used to just making these presentations and handing them over and sitting back and listening and watching. But today, and for today actually, Jeff had suggested that I come and speak to the work that I've been doing for this project. So really the question is how do we bring all this information and all this work to the public, and how do we communicate that with the public? So next slide. And we like to think of it as knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization. And as you saw in these slides through this presentation is that the visual aspect takes a lot of space. We wanted the science to be driven through the visual communications, and we wanted to make something that could seem super complex into something that was beautiful and that hopefully people would want to engage with. And finally, the written content and the work that we're doing on, the scientific components, the art, the photography, the graphic design, have more impact when we bring them together than if we keep them one at a time. Next slide. These are some of the tools that we've used for successful science translation. So you'll see a lot of photography, storytelling, art and illustration, as well as graphic design and infographics. So all these elements are really important for us in this project. Next slide. And then so once you create that content and all those visuals, how do you get it out to the public? And so again, this is a list of some of the things that we do. It's not an extensive list, but for example, we did a series of workshops called Ever Wonder How that was led by our colleague Yannick Rozo. We have our educational material, such as our Changemakers series, led by Emily DeRoshi, and a few of our Changemakers right here in the room. We have Lawrence, we have Phil, and I was also selected as a Changemaker for it, so thank you, Em. And then we did a series of published community stories, as well as just our website and all of our social media, and that's how we're mobilizing all of this work. So I'll start by talking a bit about the photography because this is really my background. I worked as a commercial photographer, and eventually I wanted to get out of the city. I wanted to get back to nature. I grew up on 50 acres of land, foraging, exploring, catching frogs, and I wanted to find a way to bring the two together. Next slide, please. So yes, here I am. This is a self-portrait while I was snorkeling. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I think a lot about my work and how it's place-based, and really it's the work that I'm doing and these photos that I'm creating are informed by the public's observations, the scientific research, as well as my own observations of nature. I spend a lot of time on the river since I've been working at the Institute. And also having a background, having a diploma as an environmental technician has been really helpful with knowing what exactly I am photographing. And then just thinking of, high quality photography, giving the subjects importance, taking the time to understand those stories and to translate them accordingly. And also just a final point, just using the photography as a witness to the work that we're doing, documenting the work that we're doing. And so for a good example of that is through our workshops and documenting those workshops. Yeah. And so some of the examples of mobilization for the photography, and one of my favorite examples is we pitched a 10-part series of community stories where we interviewed and photographed 10 members of our community that are very connected to the river and have knowledge. And so we took those stories and we pitched it to a local magazine called Perch. And so over the course of a year, they were published on their online platform. And really these stories, when we were doing these interviews, they always related back to these indicators in the scientific reports. Next slide. The next tool of translation I'd like to speak to is art and illustration. So at the beginning of the project, we were thinking of a Thanksgiving address and how incredible it would be to have it illustrated. And so we reached out to an artist named Victoria Ransom, who's very well known for incredibly intricate line drawings with layers of meaning. And we brought her onto the project to commission her to illustrate the Thanksgiving address. And this was really important to us because the Thanksgiving address really is a core element to the Great River Rapport, and it was important that we would communicate it well and beautifully. In the end, it was basically a co-creation with Victoria, where each of the drawings, and there were a total of 16 drawings to represent each theme of the Thanksgiving address. And so each drawing at the center, and for example, if I look at I know they're a little bit small here, but if we were to look at the fish theme, it's a sturgeon at the center, and then on the outside are yellow perch and macrophytes. Next, yeah. So we've mobilized these drawings through a printed book. We printed 270 copies. Actually, there's one at our River Rapport and River Strategy table just outside this room. And so the book includes the Thanksgiving address itself, the written description of each of the drawings and the meanings and the lines, as well as an artist statement from Victoria Ransom. And as well, we have a page on our website dedicated to it, so if you don't have the book, you can still see it on your own time on the River Rapport website. Then we worked really closely with Christine Fitzgerald, who's an established fine art artist who came to us, next slide, to do a co-collaboration with another organization named Oceanwise, and we came together to host a workshop where we brought students, community members, and scientists to create this artwork that was called Blue Impressions. And so all the imagery in that artwork is based on the indicators of the Great River Rapport. And here's an example. Next slide. And so really the creation of this artwork was mobilization and translation at once, where we came together to think about nature as we're creating art. It was a really beautiful day, very relaxing and just kind of enjoyable to be creating without thinking too deeply about it, but still connecting. And so anyways, we've mobilized this artwork. It's been shown across the nation, and soon it will be in Vancouver as well. And the third and final artist I wanted to speak to is Kate Schwartz. So Kate Schwartz is a young naturalist and biologist who's been connected to the River Institute since a very young age. And we brought her on and commissioned her, next slide, to make illustrations of each of our fish indicators. So we have a total of 7 indicators. We have 4 here. This is hot off the press, so you're some of the first people to see these illustrations. And so essentially all of these will be used in any kind of communication materials associated with those fish indicators. And just coming back to that importance that this is regional and it's place-based, and Kate is from here. It's not like finding an illustration from an artist that's like miles away from the St. Lawrence River. So this is, this is an important piece to what we're doing. Next slide. So this is an example of our perch page, and we have the yellow perch at the top, and you would have seen it in earlier slides. Next slide. I'll speak a little bit to the infographics, and next slide. This was really another kind of co-creation between the scientists, myself, bridging the science between, bridging between the scientists and our graphic designer. So we pulled out highlights from the technical reports that we wanted to translate to the public. There was about 5 for each indicator, and then each of those we were trying to find a way to visualize those highlights beyond our traditional graphs that we'll find in the technical reports. We wanted to find a way that maybe would be simpler or more digestible. And then again, we can see it throughout our website and any kind of communication materials having to do with those indicators. And finally, this was one of the biggest tasks for me, was the website. And I consider the website kind of the mothership for all the work and all the projects associated with the Great River Rapport. I wanted it to be a resource for knowledge, awareness, and calls to action for the Upper St. Lawrence River. And we designed it with functionality, beauty, and timelessness in mind. We want it to last a long time. We want to just, make updates and not feel like we always have to rebuild a new website, because I'm sure a few of us know it's quite a bit of work. It takes a lot of time. And so I invite you to visit riverrapport.ca. We're still working on the mobile version, so some of the pages are They're still not quite where I want them to be, but the desktop version is good to go. So again, I invite you to visit the website. So this is just some of the examples, and I think this, you can clearly see how the art, the photography, the written content, and the infographics come together to work as one. It's a little bit washed out on the projector, but I guess you'd probably get an idea. And then next slide. So, why are we doing all this? It's in the hopes that we can bridge the gap between the science and the community. And in understanding that science, we're hoping that it creates awareness, that it informs policy and informs management practices. And really, you protect what you know and what you love, and I hope that this will help people understand the river better. Thank you. So none of this could be done without all of our incredible partners. A shout out to the Environment Program at the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. And then next slide. And our funders, specifically to the RBC Foundation, who's been supporting us since the very beginning. So thank you. Symbols do you mean, like the drawings from the Thanksgiving address, or the graphic symbols? So the drawings that were kind of like the circles. So these were illustrations that are to kind of, I guess, to illustrate each of the themes. Are you familiar with the Thanksgiving address? Okay, sorry, so we didn't explain that. I'll do my best, but it's a practice of giving thanks, and this is a Haudenosaunee practice of giving thanks to all elements of creation and to share the interconnectedness of creation. And so, yeah, I guess that should probably answer, yeah.